Welcome to the P.A.S. Report Weekly Roundup Podcast. The P.A.S. Report provides an honest analysis on the critical issues that matter to you without the biased media filters. Here's your host, Professor Nicholas Giordano.
What's up, everyone? Welcome to the P.A.S. Report Podcast. This is your host, Nick Giordano, and happy that you could join me. Given it's President's Week, I wanted to serve as a reminder that we all have a role to play in this system. We have a role to play in shaping our future, and we need to respect our traditions and our past. We can all strive to embody the values and qualities of past great leaders. See, past presidents, they're great examples when it comes to courage and integrity, especially at a time that we're witnessing right now, a time of chaos and division. Over the last few decades, we've seen this insanity just envelop the entire nation, and it's accelerating more than anyone would have imagined, right? We wouldn't have pictured us in this place right now. We are witnessing a sustained and coordinated attack on our country and our history, on our presidents, and it's all in an effort to undermine the American identity. It's to weaken the glue that holds America together. It's funny that the woke revolution constantly accuses anyone that dissents from them. They accuse you of wanting to whitewash history. Yet they're the ones that want to go out there and cancel presidents. That's the ultimate whitewash of history. Erasing past presidents results in a dumbed-down version of America, and that's what we're witnessing. And it's a disservice to our past, our present, our future. I always talk about teaching the totality of America, both the good and the bad. And that includes our presidents. Our presidents have done remarkable things, and were able to hold the fabric of our country together. Even at times when it appeared that everything was going to collapse, they rose to meet the challenges. And while many of our presidents have done great things, it's also important to recognize that there have been presidents that haven't done great things. That presidents are human beings. They're flawed creatures. They're going to be flawed. Applying 21st century standards to those living in the 18th and 19th and even the early 20th century shows just how simple-minded so many people have become, looking for easy answers rather than understanding the complexities of our history, including our leaders. Every day we hear vicious attacks on the idea of America, from our founding to the present day. Some call this the new cultural war, but it goes beyond the cultural war. This is an authoritarian movement disguised as what they want to deem as progress. But just think over the last few years. Think about everything going on today. Does it feel like progress to you? Does it feel like the United States is in a better place today than it was just 15 years ago, 20 years ago, 25 years ago? See, to me, it feels like we've taken a giant step back when it comes to some of the issues. We've taken a giant step forward towards a dystopian future where only one narrative will be tolerated, and those that dissent from the narrative are going to be attacked and marginalized. This is going to be the central focus of the episode. I'm going to get to it all. Before I do, make sure you subscribe to the podcast. If you find the show informative, share it with your family and friends, and leave a rating and review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, whatever podcast platforms that allow it. In keeping with the President's Day, on Sunday we did learn some bad news. We learned that former President Jimmy Carter, he's entered hospice. While he hasn't passed away as of this recording, most of us know that hospice care exists to manage the end of someone's life, try and make them as comfortable as possible. Former President Carter is a remarkable 98 years old. And when I say remarkable, I mean this guy, he's had a remarkable life. He is the nation's longest-lived president in our history. Think about it this way. The guy left the presidency 42 years ago. 42 years ago. God bless. When we look at his administration, a lot of people, listen, I give President Carter a hard time. He certainly gets poor marks for how he administered and managed the United States of America, but we also do have to recognize that he entered the presidency during a period of extraordinary challenges. There was a deep dissatisfaction in America, not dissimilar to what we're witnessing today. Only back then, the nation, it was reeling. It was reeling from the Watergate scandal and the downfall of President Nixon. You had the debacle of Vietnam. President Carter had to contend with the growing instability in the international community and aggressive Soviet Union, deal with the poor economy and energy crisis, 1979 Islamic Revolution in Iran, the Iranian hostage crisis, ultimately defining his administration. And President Carter, he did falter. He faltered because of his inability to lead through strength and build meaningful relationships within Congress. His inability to build coalitions led to a direct challenge to his presidency from within the Democrat Party itself when Senator Ted Kennedy challenged him in 1980. That challenge ultimately doomed the Carter presidency. He was no match for Reagan. He was weakened. However, While many do look at the Carter administration as a failed presidency, the most important accomplishment that gets forgotten about today is his work in solidifying the Camp David Accords, where Egypt recognized Israel's right to exist and the two countries forged a peace agreement. Because of this agreement, nearly all of President Carter's successors followed his lead in attempting to mediate and resolve international disputes, promote human rights, to varying degrees, of course. But it was the Camp David Accords that would mark the foundations for the Abraham Accords 40 years later under former President Trump. Another thing that doesn't get talked about often, and this is what I miss about Democrats and people like President Jimmy Carter, he was actually someone that was a fiscal hawk. He wanted to cut the budget. He wanted to bring some fiscal responsibility back to the table. That's why Ted Kennedy actually challenged him, because they felt that President Carter wasn't going far enough in social spending. We need those Democrats back. You know, interestingly enough, it's Carter's post-presidency that is largely celebrated and seen as a success. He was able to rehabilitate his image post-presidency among both Democrats and Republicans. Carter exhibits the true essence of the American identity. He didn't allow the criticisms of his time serving the country to consume or hinder him. He overcame a failed presidency to become a well-respected former president. And his favorability ratings reflect that. It shows how our failures do not define us. It's what we do with those failures that actually matter. And the former president, he's living proof of that. You know, Jimmy Carter, he's an interesting guy. He came from very humble beginnings on a peanut farm, served in the Navy, became a state senator, became a governor, ultimately becoming president of the United States. And it reflects the greatness of America. Doesn't matter what family you're born into. Doesn't matter where you come from, how much money you have. The beauty of America is that we are not an aristocracy. It doesn't matter where we come from. It doesn't matter what our beginnings are. America is the land of opportunity. If you look at many previous presidents, given that it's President's Week, they didn't come from families and wealth. Many came from abject poverty and difficult circumstances, and they were able to rise up to lead the most powerful nation on the face of this earth. You look at people like President Jackson, Lincoln, Garfield, Chester A. Arthur, Truman, Nixon, Clinton, so many of our presidents. Think about how remarkable that is. You go to many other countries in the world where the family you're born into defines who you are, defines what you're going to be in life, defines the success you're going to achieve in life. But that's not the United States. And while I don't agree with the former president's policies, I certainly don't agree with his push towards globalism. I do have an enormous amount of respect for him. He was a good and decent man. I don't think there's a single person, Republican or Democrat, that could truly say anything negative about his overall character and the type of person he was. With that being said, I mean, the best thing that happened to the Carter presidency was the Biden presidency. We often hear a lot of comparisons between the two administrations, and I bring it up all the time. I've brought it up on several occasions, but there are a few key differences. For one, President Carter wasn't responsible for the Vietnam War. He wasn't responsible for the failed Great Society programs ushered in under the Johnson administration. He wasn't responsible for Nixon's downfall or the Watergate scandal. Stagflation was already here before he became president. Granted, many of Carter's policies didn't help the economy. Another major difference is that Carter sought to mediate between nations and avert a war, like he did with the Camp David Accords. This administration, well, when it comes to the Russian invasion of Ukraine, they were twiddling their thumbs. They wanted it to happen. I mean, here we're on the brink of World War III. And yes, we are on the brink of it. All because of the failed policies of this administration. It's insane what's going on out there. It's insane how they keep pushing and pushing and pushing, looking for an expansion of this war. You know, they could say that they don't want a wider scale conflict, but they're not doing anything to offer any type of diplomatic solution to resolve this conflict. You have President Biden over in Ukraine promising that as long as it takes, we're going to provide them with anything and everything they need. How long before troops are on the ground in Ukraine? And not for nothing, I mean, you know, I know there's a lot of people out there that feel bad, feel horrible, feel terrible for the Ukrainian people. I'm one of them. Who the hell would want to live like that? I won't want to live in a war zone. I won't want to have to go to sleep at night worrying if a mortar's going to drop on my house. I won't want to have to worry about sending my kids to school, worrying if that school's going to get blown up. I won't want to have to live like that. But at the same time, we have to understand, what are our national interests? What is what's in our best interest? Not what's in Ukraine's best interest. What's in our best interest? See, for Ukraine, their best interest is dragging us into this war. Their best interest is NATO getting into a kinetic war with Russia. But we have to look at what's in our best interest. When we don't do that, we fail. And, we have Carter, again, it's a great example because he's someone where you had the Egyptian-Israeli talks look like they were on the brink of collapse, and yet he persevered. He pushed through it, and he got the two sides to come to an agreement. That's leadership right there. What do we have now? Even down to the failed Iranian hostage rescue attempt. Under the Carter administration, you have the 1979 Islamic Revolution, you have 53 American hostages, I believe it's 53 American hostages being held, 444 days in the U.S. Embassy over in Iran. Carter tried to do a rescue attempt, but it failed, unfortunately. However, Carter showed leadership. He took accountability for the failed rescue attempt. And then, after the failed rescue attempt, he used diplomatic back channels to broker a deal to get the hostages released. Ultimately, the hostages were released due to the agreement. Now, most credit Reagan administration with the release of the American hostages, but it was Carter's administration that negotiated the deal. The mullahs released the hostages when Reagan was inaugurated, so they get one last dig in at Carter. Now, you juxtapose that with our withdrawal from Afghanistan, and you see the failed presidency. The failed withdrawal from Afghanistan was devastating to America's interest. It was devastating to our power and influence around the world. We were significantly hurt. It's not to say that we should have stayed in Afghanistan. That was always going to be a disaster. But the way we withdrew harmed U.S. foreign policy and U.S. interests all over the world. The fact is, after 20 years of war, over $1 trillion spent, 2,500 soldiers returned in flag-draped coffins, and tens of thousands of wounded, the idea that the Taliban was able to retake control of the country in less than a week after we announced it, not even after we left, in less than a week after we announced it, is absolutely pathetic. Also, don't forget, President Biden can't say he was handed Afghanistan because he was a key player from the start, from his days in the Senate to his 8 years as vice president. He and many of the players that are involved in Afghanistan, like Secretary of Defense Austin or General Mark Milley, they are all responsible for the policy decisions over the past 20 years. Policy decisions that weaken the United States throughout the international community. But the main difference between Carter and Biden was that Carter was generally a good and decent human being. Biden is not. And there's reasons I'm saying that. Some of you may be like, well, you're going a little too hard. No. President Carter did not seek division. You could disagree with Carter on policy, but you cannot attack him personally. He wasn't someone who actively sought to divide and marginalize the American people. He never attacked supporters of his political opponents. He never attacked America and the American identity. He never attacked ordinary Americans themselves. He didn't seek to divide Americans on characteristics like race and gender. That's all President Biden does. He's constantly attacking ordinary Americans. He constantly seeks to divide us by using race and gender. Remember, this is the guy who said he didn't want his kids to grow up in a racial jungle. This is the guy who said in 2012 that it was Republicans who wanted to put black people back in chains. He was the one that Republicans, he said, wanted to bring back segregation to the South. That Republicans make Jim Crow look like Jim Eagle. Just take a listen.
What I'm worried about is how un-American this whole initiative is. It's sick. It's sick. Deciding in some states that you cannot bring water to people standing in line, waiting to vote. Deciding that you're going to end voting at 5 o'clock when working people are just getting off work. Deciding that there will be no absentee ballots under the most rigid circumstances. And so I'm convinced that we'll be able to stop this because it is the most pernicious thing. This makes Jim Crow look like Jim Eagle. I mean, this is gigantic, what they're trying to do. And it cannot be sustained. And do everything in my power, along with my friends in the House and the Senate, to keep that from becoming the law.
He was talking about the voter laws in Georgia, and everything he said was a lie or a misrepresentation of the facts. It turns out that the law was actually really successful. Most voters across Georgia actually supported it, and Georgia saw the record-breaking voter turnout after the law was passed. So it was all lies, but it doesn't matter to people like President Biden. It's about dividing and conquering. What about when President Biden went on an all-out attack against Americans who had reservations about the COVID vaccine? Does anyone remember this, Jem?
We've been patient, but our patience is wearing thin. And your refusal has cost all of us.
What about when he ranted and raved about those MAGA Republicans who he called fascists, domestic terrorists, extremists that represent the greatest threat to the Republic since the Civil War in the entirety of American history? Those were his words, not mine. The guy's a lunatic when he gave that speech with the dark red lights and the two military officers behind him. But last week, he hit an all-time low. Remember, this is a president who constantly refers to himself as the uniter-in-chief, not the divider-in-chief. This is a man who says he wants to bring all Americans together, that he isn't the president of white America or black America. He's not the president of blue America or red America. He's the president for all Americans. And so what did the uniter-in-chief have to say? Well, he gave remarks last Thursday for Black History Month, and he was talking about lynching. And I want you to take a listen to what this uniter-in-chief had to say.
It was almost exactly 1 year ago that I signed a law more than 100 years in the making. It was an honor. It was one of the great honors of my career, the Emmett Till Anti-Lynching Act, making lynching a federal hate crime. You know, folks, lynching is pure terror, enforcing the lie that not everyone belongs in America and not everyone is created equal. Pure terror to systematically undermine hard-fought civil rights. Innocent men, women, children hung by a noose from trees, bodies burned, drowned, castrated. Their crimes: trying to vote, trying to go to school, trying to own a business, trying to preach the gospel, false accusations of murder, arson, robbery, lynched for simply being black, nothing more. With white crowds, white families gathered to celebrate the spectacle, taking pictures of the bodies and mailing them as postcards. Hard to believe, but that's what was done. And some people still want to do that.
How horrible is that?
How dare you!
Some uniter-in-chief, right? I mean, seriously, we're in the 21st century. I want to know who the hell still supports the idea of lynching out there. Who supports these types of human rights abuses? I mean, really? He says white families want to take pictures of dead people who were lynched and mail them as postcards. What kind of president talks like that? What century are we living in? And just to make the audience aware, what happened to black people was horrific, but Italians were also lynched too. In fact, the largest one-day lynching occurred in 1891 in Louisiana against the Italians. And so since I brought up the idea of Italians, let's bring in Vincent LaGuardia Gambini to get his thoughts on what the president said about white people wanting to take pictures and send postcards of those that are lynched.
Everything that guy just says is bullshit. Thank you.
A lot of people try and say Biden's a nice guy, but he's not a nice guy. He's not a nice guy. And listen, yes, he is suffering from Alzheimer's and dementia, but like I said, he's the one that talked about racial jungles, 40, 50 years ago. He's the one that constantly plays the race card, trying to divide Americans, pit Americans against each other. He's the one that called black people predators in 1994. It really is stunning when you think of the way he behaves, and nobody reports on it. Nobody reported on these remarks where he says that white people want to see black people lynched and then take pictures with the dead bodies with their families so that they could send them as postcards. Every single Democrat should be asked if they repudiate President Biden's remarks. See, anytime a Republican says something really stupid, the other Republicans will constantly get hounded. Well, the same thing needs to happen with Democrats. Do they agree with President Biden's remarks? Are we really going to say that Americans in 2023 want to lynch other Americans? Is that what we're really saying? Now, the press won't ever press another Democrat on these issues, but we should. However, it does get to a more important point. Rather than recognize the progress that we've made when it comes to race relations in the United States, they make it as if nothing has ever changed. And that's the thing. See, they know that we've made great progress. Are we perfect? No, we're not going to be perfect. But they make it as if racism is worse today than it's ever been. And to say that about America and the American people is a disgrace. We are generally good and decent people. Are there some people out there that are fueled by hate, racism, and anger? Of course there are. But they are marginalized. They are a marginalized few. Why do some feel the need to constantly denigrate America and the people of the United States? I don't get it. Well, I get it, but it's really disgusting when you think about the reasons that they're doing it, because there is a reason. And the dangerous aspect to all this is that we're now witnessing seep into all aspects of our society, particularly within our institutions. And I want to discuss that. We're going to take a quick break, but when we get back, I want to discuss how our institutions, another example has emerged about how they're getting ideologically weaponized to target their political opposition. So we're going to take a quick break. We'll be right back. As someone who worked in emergency management, I routinely sounded the alarm bells on our outdated grid system. Think back to 2003 when a tree branch hit a power line in Ohio, shutting down power to the entire eastern seaboard. Around 100 people died, and this was one of the costliest disasters in American history, with losses totaling over $60 billion. Even the White House sees it. They're saying 2/3 of the grid are at least 25 years old, and they recently announced billions of dollars to update it. But we're talking about the government here. How long do you think that's going to take, if at all? When an incident happens, you have to rely on yourself. Be prepared for yourself and your family. With the Patriot Power Generator, you get a solar generator that doesn't install into your house because it's portable. You can take it with you, even use it inside. But it's powerful enough for your phones, medical devices, and even your fridge. Right now, you can go to 4patriots.com, use code P.A.S. to get 10% off your first purchase on anything in the store, including the Patriot Power Generator. You'll also get their famous guarantee for an entire year after your order, plus free shipping on orders over $97. A portion of every sale is donated to charities who support veterans and their families. Just go to 4patriots.com, use code P.A.S. to get 10% off. That's 4patriots.com, use code P.A.S. to get yours today. Welcome back. And, I've often spoken about the government abuses within the American bureaucracy on this podcast. If you've been listening, I've been highlighting and detailing all the abuses that have occurred over the last 20 years. I've explained how our institutions are being ideologically weaponized for political purposes. I've explained how they are using the powers of government to target political opponents. And 2 weeks ago, I brought up an FBI memo that seeks to target traditional Catholics and paint them as extremists. Now, I didn't get in depth. It was an interview episode, so I had to do an interview. But I want to explain it with a little more depth, because the more I dig in, the more concerned I become. Now, in full disclosure, it is important for you to know that the FBI has announced that they have since rescinded the memo, that the author or authors, we don't really know, shouldn't have put this out there. It goes against FBI policy. The data used, well, there was no data used. The analysis used was wrought with flaws, and so they're rescinding it. However, the fact that it was even leaked out in the first place, the fact that it was even written up in the first place, the intent is clear. And I do want to make clear, too, when going through this document, the document refers to the radical traditional Catholics, not simply traditional Catholics. The author makes a piss-poor attempt to try and distinguish Catholics from what he or she deems radical traditional Catholics. It does make an attempt nonetheless, so I do have to state that because I want to be straight with you. But getting to this memo, the authors try to link together white supremacy and traditional Catholics, which is interesting, because if anyone actually knows and understands white supremacist ideology, they would know that white supremacists are not really fond of Catholics. In fact, they have a history of targeting Catholics. Not sure what religion the authors of this memo belong to, but it's obviously not Catholicism. If they were Catholics, they would know that white supremacists do not like Catholics in particular. They would also know that there are many black people who identify as Catholic. There's an enormous Hispanic population. 55% of the Hispanic population actually identifies as Catholics. So if white supremacists are trying to infiltrate the church in order to recruit other white supremacists, well, the church may not be the best place to do it, right? However, pay close attention to what they are doing and what the document is saying. So in one section of the document, it discusses increasing hostility to, quote, abortion rights activists in the run-up to and following the Supreme Court stop decision. Now, this is interesting for two reasons. First of all, why use the word abortion rights activists? Why not pro-choice activists? It's subtle, but there is a distinction, and that's why I explained in previous podcasts. When government agents are writing these documents, they're like wordsmiths. By calling it abortion rights, the author is implying that abortion is a fundamental right as opposed to a choice. By elevating it to a right, it's designed to paint those opposed to the practice of abortion as extremists. They are extremists who want to suppress other people's rights. That's why word usage matters. The authors of these documents, they know exactly what they're doing. The second reason that this is interesting is because the authors of the document, they don't point to specific examples or incidents of pro-life people attacking, quote-unquote, abortion rights activists. I'm surprised they just didn't use reproductive rights. I'm surprised they didn't do that. But they didn't provide any type of stat that exists to illustrate that there's been some increase in attacks on those. And the author never mentioned or referenced any of the over 100 physical attacks on pro-life organizations, including churches and crisis pregnancy centers, since the Dobbs decision. So that shows intent, right? So you're ignoring all the actual physical attacks that did happen in order to target those that are pro-life. In the document, it also tries to label traditional Catholics as extremists because Catholicism teaches that we are only two genders, right? Men and women. That God is the creator, God created two genders, and apparently this is now extremist thinking, right? That's how crazy it's become. Pushing back against transgender initiatives, well, now that's considered anti-LGBTQ. See, they don't want to have a debate on the trans issue. They want to dominate the issue. If I say I'm against kids as young as 9, 10, 11 years old getting hormone therapy, well, then I'm labeled as anti-trans, a bigot. If I say I don't believe that kids should be chemically castrated, you're anti-trans. If I say that I don't believe trans women should be able to participate in women's sports, well, I'm a horrible person. I'm discriminating against the trans community. If I say I don't want my 6-year-old kid being taught gender fluidity and having trans story time, then I'm the mean and hateful one. You see how this works? So you're taking the teachings of Catholicism, you're painting them as radicalism, and obviously I'm taking a sensible, legitimate position on the issue. I would guarantee you that 80 to 90% of the American people would actually agree with me. Most of them are cowards that won't ever speak up, but I would guarantee that the overwhelming majority of people would agree that children shouldn't be given hormone replacement therapy when they can't even take a school field trip without parental consent. I would guarantee you the majority of Americans would agree that children shouldn't be able to start the transitioning process, that males shouldn't be able to play in female sports. But you can't say these things out loud anymore because these are apparently extremist positions to at least some FBI agents out there. You know, they want to lump traditional Catholic teachings and make them as if they're some part of a far-right white supremacist ideology. And while the author states that radical traditional Catholics are a minority, that those radical traditionalist Catholics adhere to, quote, anti-Semitic, anti-immigrant, anti-LGBT, and white supremacy, quote, on ideology. Now, again, so if I say that I want a secure border, that's going to make me anti-immigrant? I'm not anti-immigrant. I actually believe in improving our legal immigration system. I think it's ridiculous that people have to pay immigration lawyers $10,000 or thousands of dollars at the very least to try and become a citizen. I think it's ridiculous that it takes 5, 6, 7 years to become a citizen in the United States, especially when you are worthy of being here, when you've displayed some level of merit to be in the United States. But see, you talk about border security, well, now you're anti-immigrant. You see what they do. Those that prefer traditional Latin masses, those are extremists. Again, the author doesn't state a particular percentage, and he leaves it so vague and open-ended that really any Catholic can fall under this memo. It reminds me a lot of the school board memo, right? Where they wanted to target parents as domestic terrorists. No, they didn't use, Attorney General Garland didn't use the word domestic terrorism in his actual memo, but we know what the intent was. We know they were threat-tagging parents. And if any of you out there want to challenge me on that, oh, they weren't threatening parents, they weren't threat-tagging them, they weren't calling them domestic terrorists. Well, no, we actually have the leaked emails where they were talking about threat-tagging parents, as if the school board is above reproach, as if you're not allowed to complain to the school board. And I warned you. I warned each and every one of you, depending on how long you've been listening to this podcast, but I warned in June of 2021 that the Biden administration's national strategy for countering domestic terrorism was going to do just this. I explained it, and I've provided numerous examples of how this plan has been operational, how it's being used to target political opponents. I explained how they use vague labels like anti-government, anti-authority sentiment, incitement. Never explained those things, and you could attach to anything, but I explained how the national strategy is going to be manipulated. I explained in how Pillar 1 shows how the government is going to use public and private organizations to serve as their eyes and ears of the government, how they will use information they provide to target Americans. And when you go through the FBI memo targeting Catholics, one thing that immediately popped out to me were the footnotes in the entire document, where they relied on information from news outlets like Salon and The Atlantic, two very far-left news outlets. Even more startling were the several references to the Southern Poverty Law Center, Amazing, because in June of 2021, I called out the Southern Poverty Law Center. When I was talking about the national strategy, I said specifically, raising the question, are they going to be using the Southern Poverty Law Center for their analysis? Take a listen. This brings us to the 4 pillars the national strategy is going to focus on. And Pillar 1 begins on page 15. It sounds fairly innocuous, although you could easily see the abuses and the politicization that can happen. As someone that understands, reads, writes government documents, you begin to look for this sort of stuff, and you could cut through the BS and see where it's going to be abused. In any event, Pillar 1 focuses on understanding and sharing domestic terrorism-related information. It discusses how in order to understand the threat, in order to address the threat, we have to understand it. I don't have any problems with that. When I was in emergency management, we constantly conducted risk and threat assessments. It's the smart thing to do. You have to understand the threats that exist out there. What does concern me is how the strategy says, quote, maximizing the federal government's understanding of this particular threat also means supporting and making appropriate use of analysis performed by entities outside the government. But what entities are we talking about? Shouldn't we know that? While the document says it's going to avoid bias and improper influence, I mean, that's laughable. Are you serious? We do have to put pressure on the government to ask them what entities are they talking about. Just to give you an example, just take the Southern Poverty Law Center, because I can guarantee you the government's going to be using the Southern Poverty Law Center. The media routinely uses data from this organization. This organization is nothing more than a far-left organization. This organization is one that likes to target political opponents. This is an organization that labeled Ayaan Hirsi Ali and Majid Nawaz as anti-Muslim extremists. Why? Because they had the audacity to speak out against the hardcore Salafist Wahhabi sect of Islam. So this is an organization, the Southern Poverty Law Center, that's going to go after Christian groups. They've gone after the Family Research Council. So now is the SPLC going to have a seat at the table for the FBI to conduct their intel analysis and operations? Another concerning aspect of the first pillar is how the government calls for working more closely with the private sector. The report says the private sector may be the first to identify a potential threat and that the information sharing is essential. They want private corporations to identify early threats by what the report deems as, quote, credible non-governmental analysis, end quote. They want these public and private entities to serve as the government's eyes and ears. This is nothing more than a backdoor attempt to spy on ordinary Americans and bypass the warrant process. Given what we witnessed over the last 2 decades, you know that the private entities are going to be compliant. You know they're going to willingly share information with the government whenever the government requests this information. See, it's much easier for corporations to willingly turn over private information than it is for the government to go have to obtain a warrant. Are all these private entities going to be filing suspicious activity reports like the banking sector does? Will these suspicious activity reports be filed against so-called radicals who take the wrong position on things like guns or education or healthcare, immigration, or virtually any other issue? So Pillar 1 is concerning. The other pillars concern me more, but Pillar 1 is extremely concerning, and we should be asking questions. I'm not trying to boast. I'm not trying to say, oh, I'm right. I'm showing you how the intent of the national strategy was obvious and predictable. The FBI memo is showing how Pillar 1 is operational. It's showing how Pillar 3 is operational. The FBI memo, and Pillar 2 certainly is, that's the censorship model, but the FBI memo talks about infiltrating Catholic churches to recruit potential informants. They want to turn our nation into a nation of rats, where everyone's looking out against each other. And if you look at any authoritarian country, this is how they operate. You turn citizens against one another, where you always need to be suspicious of everyone else. It's completely ridiculous. You know, and I do have to confess, I supported tactics like this when it came to infiltrating mosques. And you have to wonder, how many mosques were infiltrated that had no links to any type of Islamic extremism? If there is a threat emanating from a specific religious institution, so I don't care if it's a Catholic church or a mosque, I don't have a problem with investigating that institution. However, reading this FBI memo illustrates how wide the net really is and how easily it can be abused. So imagine over the course of the last 20 years how it was abused. And this brings me back to President's Day, President's Week. When you have failed leadership, this is what happens. Many of our institutions, they've been ideologically corrupted. They are using narratives to target political opposition. It appears that you must adhere and check all the boxes of all far-left radical positions, and if you deviate on some of those issues, you're going to be labeled as a fringe right-wing extremist. You're going to be labeled as a Putin lover. Pro-Kremlin. They have taken completely reasonable positions and have declared them far right. And I have to say, the scary part is they've been successful. They have moved the debate so far from the norms that the center has shifted dramatically too. Understand that it's not to say that you can't criticize the United States, our institutions, or our politicians. You listen to this podcast. This is something I routinely do. I do it every single day. But I never attack the idea of America. I never attack the premise of America, and that's exactly what they do. I never criticize the intent or the country as a whole. My criticisms are reserved for those in power. It's reserved for the officials, both elected and appointed. It's not for the country. Many of us have forgotten that it's our duty to always ask questions. Always question the government, always question the officials, push back, ask why are they doing these things? And the reason that you do that is try and hold them accountable, keep them honest. It's our civic obligation to be skeptical of government, to be critical of those who hold power, whether you agree with them or not. What makes what is happening today so dangerous is that they're undermining the entire idea of nationhood. See, we don't have thousands of years of recorded history that links our society together. We don't have a common culture, a common language, shared ethnicities. We don't have a shared history. And even if you do have all those things, it's still difficult to keep societies intact. Without them, it makes it much more difficult. And that's the position we're finding ourselves in today. We are linked together through common values and American ideals that have been the cornerstone of this country since our founding. Yet, as the sustained and coordinated attack on the ideas of America continues and more people in the United States are actually unaware of our real history, how much longer will the glue hold us together? How much longer? So it's up to us to learn about our system. It's up to us to ask questions. It's up to us to try and hold government accountable, expose the officials for some of the frauds that they are. And we need real leadership to come back to the United States, not career politicians that have been there for 50 years. We need leaders who have the best interests of the country in mind. Now, I hope you found the content of this episode informative. I appreciate all the 5-star ratings on Apple Podcasts. If you have 30 seconds, please write a good review. I want to thank you for joining me. I'll be back on Monday with another great episode of the P.A.S. Report podcast.
Thank you for listening to the P.A.S. Report Weekly Roundup Podcast.
Have a good one. Bye.
Be sure to rate, share, and subscribe to the podcast so you'll never miss an episode. Also, visit PASreport.com and follow us on Twitter at PAS Report.